I've grown a lot of plants in my day, but one plant I have never grown is the humble orchid. And believe it or not, there's so much more to orchids than you might imagine, certainly more than I thought. So I'm here in San Diego, California at the San Diego Botanic Garden to see an old friend, John Clements, at the World of Orchids exhibit. Let's go find him. The man.
Hey, Kevin, you caught me.
The myth, you taking some photos of the orchids?
I was taking photos.
How you doing?
Good. Nice to see you again.
Well, last time we saw you, this place looked completely different. It was the World of Houseplants exhibit.
It was.
And I think we were standing right where a corpse flower was.
That's about right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This place changes all the time.
It does.
And that's one of the neat things about this greenhouse is
Yeah.
that we constantly are reconfiguring it and making it into different shows and events and things. It's really fun.
Well, right now, it's the World of Orchids exhibit. There's about 200 plus different varieties in here. I can smell it. Why don't we start where orchids started? I mean, I don't know much about them. I haven't grown them much in my life. The only times I've ever received them, I think is probably how most people these days would get them, which is happy graduation or, you know, it's your birthday, that kind of gift.
Sure.
But what do we need to know about orchids just from a botanical level? Like, what family are they in, that kind of stuff?
Right. Well, they're in the Liliaceae family, so they're related to lilies and irises and things. And they are really all over the world.
Yeah.
The only continent that orchids don't occur in is Antarctica.
Do you know the actual like historical origin of how they started being collected and cultivated and maybe even bred? Or
very often wealthy people or royalty would dispatch people around the world on boats, and they would go out looking for plants, collect them and bring them back. And not just with orchids, other kinds of plants too, but and to the point where they really wiped out certain areas in the world.
Not the best practice in the world.
Not the greatest practice.
Why don't we kind of walk around and look at some of the unique ones?
Well, that's what's
so
neat
many,
about what we've got going here. You know, the Trader Joe's orchids typically are going to be Phalaenopsis. And these are all species and really complex hybrids that orchid growers really grow that are just total addicts.
This is not, you're not finding this at Trader Joe's.
No, that's just like probably 500 blooms on that plant. And that's Silogene cristata. Cristata in Latin means crested, and so it's really referring to that dorsal sepal there. And, and so they're just spectacular.
Why don't we take a look at this one right here? Because this one I feel like illustrates something you were telling me about orchids that's just a feature of them no matter where they are in the world, is the structure of the petals and the flower, et cetera. So can we break that down?
Sure.
Yeah.
So with orchids, they really all have exactly the same structure, and that's what distinguishes an orchid. And so if I were to look at this orchid, I can show that they either have petals and sepals on the flower, and they have 3 of each. So the sepals will always be at that dorsal position at 12 o'clock.
So the top.
The top, and then you'll have a sepal here and a sepal here, usually.
And what's the difference between a sepal and a petal?
So the petals are the other structure.
Yeah.
So the petals would be here and here. And then this is what really distinguishes an orchid from all the other plants in the Liliaceae family, is that it has one petal that has been adapted to become a lip. And so every single orchid, regardless of species, regardless of where it occurs in the world, they'll all have that structure.
And that happens when we look at this one right here, which is
Dendrochilium multiflora.
Multiflora mean multiple flowers, right? So if you were to look, there you go. You have that lip right at the bottom there on that little tuft of yellow.
It has the same structure form.
Yeah, just obviously much more per flower spike, I guess. Right.
And when we look at cattleyas in a little bit, then you'll really see a lip and a half. I mean, there are some that form a lip that is not in proportion to the rest of the flower, where it really just sticks out.
Aggressive,
big and beautiful and frilly, you know.
I was gonna say, I can't tell if you're into it or if you're not into it.
I really like them. Yeah, that's my favorite.
Let's take a look at some of the ones over here then.
Yeah.
So these ones here, Dendrobium roy tokunaga. Talk to me about the breeding sort of culture in orchids. Is that huge? I mean, I can only imagine it's maybe as much as roses or other plants like that.
You know, this one is from an Australian Dendrobium. And so, and again, that's one of the best orchids to get from Australia would be these Dendrobiums. And then there's very good record keeping. So you can go in the Royal Horticultural Society, and my name's in there on a couple of hybrids from a long time ago, 40 years ago. No, I actually don't even have the plants anymore. And so what's interesting is that we can look up this hybrid, we'll look up that name, and then it will show who bred it, the year they bred it, and then what the genealogy is, which is kind of fun.
Sort of like a pet breeding, like
it's like the AKC. If you bought a dog, you could actually find the parentage and find where that's recorded. And so all the orchid hybrids do have that in common. We can look them up.
So when you look at like an orchid like this one here, the Zygopetalum hybrid here, to me, I say, does this follow the same pattern? Because you've got that bottom lip that you've talked about.
Correct.
But then these ones seem to be in different positions a bit.
Well, what you can see here is that these two sepals have kind of come up slightly, but it's still that same form.
Yeah.
We still have this sepal here,
Those
sepal
two,
here,
yeah.
the two petals, and then what's happened here with this other petal, it's just this really neat big lip.
So, and that's mostly a breeding decision to sort of force it to show in that way.
In some ways,
Yeah.
and so you can accentuate that, but in nature, the hybrids, will accentuate sometimes what nature has, but you'll find like Zygopetalum intermedia in nature, it will be very close to this already with that great big lip. This is another one that's really fragrant, and it's just beautiful, and some of these will have a really bright kind of a chartreuse color mixed with this brown and usually a blue or a purple lip, and that knocks my socks off.
I mean, let's
so pretty.
I want to hit this one real quick. Let me see.
Yeah, and that one has a nice
That's
scent.
a very punchy, fruity scent almost to me.
2 weeks ago when this plant first came in, it smelled sweeter, and to me it smells a little almost mothbally right now. Just has, it's morphing over time, and the scent will change.
So when I see this one, I see, these are growing in pots, it looks
Correct.
like, but most orchids is maybe the Phalaenopsis that you get at Trader Joe's. It's an epiphytic plant, right? Meaning it does not want to be put in soil. It's sort of grown next to trees or on trees.
Right.
Is that the case with all orchids, or are there different ways?
There's really three different groups. There's terrestrial types that literally grow in the ground, and so like here in our country, we actually have. In the Midwest and certain other places, we have lady slipper orchids. Those are sometimes in the swamp, sometimes they're in soil. And then we have epiphytic types that usually grow like we have in the rest of the conservatory.
Sure.
You can see they're just attached to a tree trunk or a limb. And the roots are literally exposed and they cover it and really adhere to it.
In that case, nutrients are coming from basically rain, dew, mist, etc.
And the accumulation of detritus from the forest
like in the cracks of
things. And then that, as it goes into solution, will be available to the plant. And then there's lithophytic, which they either grow on rock faces or on cliffs, sometimes on sandstone faces, and then you'll have them sometimes in like a gravel aggregate where you'll see some orchids.
And that to me would, just thinking about the way the plant would uptake nutrients, would be the most extreme environment. Because it's not terrestrial, so there's no soil to pull from. It's not epiphytic, there's no like detritus, etc. It would have to be whatever just falls from like natural decay, I suppose, right? Yeah.
And then you'll find a lot of times in nature, the orchids are going to grow a lot more slowly because they don't have access to a lot of nutrients. Commercial growers and hobbyists, they're feeding these plants a lot. There's a nice hummingbird. We have a hummingbird nest in here, Kevin.
Do you really?
Up in there, there's a neat little
Are they
hummingbird
hitting,
nest.
that actually brings us to an interesting point, and I know over here, I'd love to kind of jump over here and take a look at some of these, because when you think about the orchid, you think about, okay, well, yes, there's a crazy breeding culture, but obviously they came from the wild, and how do they propagate themselves in the wild? Are they attracting pollinators in some way? How are they doing that?
They do, and some are pollinated by moths. Many are pollinated by bees, some by flies, and one of the telltales that you can use to see orchids that are often pollinated by flies would be the coloring. Sometimes they'll have brown and dark purples, kind of mimicking like meat and things, a bit like the corpse flower, something decaying. And they'll draw flies in, and it's really interesting. There are some orchids that have ultraviolet patterns you don't even see, but that on the lip it'll mimic, for instance, a bee. And a bee sees in a different color range than we do, and he'll see that and think, oh, it's another bee, and I'm going to go in and
it's almost like the social
friends.
proof.
Yeah,
the bee, if another bee's there, I might as well,
So they'll go in and they'll sometimes breed that way.
Wow, that is
really
fascinating.
And in fact, we have a Darwin orchid up in that basket. It just went out of bloom. That particular one is famously known as the Darwin orchid because when Darwin was on one of his voyages, they went to Madagascar. He saw this thing in bloom and he was just stunned. It has a lip that is a spur, and it goes down about 1.5 feet. So it's called Angraecum sesquipedale, which means 1.5 feet spur.
Okay, so we know how they're pollinated. Once they're pollinated, how do they reproduce? Like, are they producing a seed pod? Are they?
Yeah, they are. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'm going to grab an orchid over here.
Let's take a look.
There's one flower left here on one of our orchids. This is Cattleya intermedia.
Oh.
And I'm going to just pop this off.
Oh, I feel like we're committing a sin almost.
Oh, it's okay. Sometimes people collect the orchids to make corsages or cut flower arrangements.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
a lot of times you'll see vandas or these dendrobiums in cut flower arrangements, so I don't feel too bad.
Okay. Yeah, let me get ahead of that.
This
real
one
quick.
doesn't have a fragrance, but what I want to show you
Very
is
light, very
very
light,
light.
yeah.
So again, we've got that structure, the petals, and then this adapted petal, which becomes a lip. The sepals, but this is where all the pollinating action happens. I'm going to pull this lip down. So think about with orchids too, that frequently this lip acts as a landing strip. An insect will come, land here, and then it'll work its way up, smelling the nectar. And then this is what we call the pollen cap. And I'm going to just pop this off.
Pop the cap.
Pop the cap. Boom.
Whoa.
So when I'm breeding orchids, this is what we would use as the pollen. And we can take that off. You can see those little pollen grains.
Oh, wow.
And then the female aspect of things is in here, the stigma. And that's just behind here. So if I wanted to breed this orchid, I would take the pollen and then put it up under that stigma. And then this would swell. Within a couple of days, the flower would wilt.
Yeah.
And then I would begin to form a seed pod. And
okay.
inside an orchid, as unlike typical seeds that are really large, it's like dust.
So if you were doing that, like you just said, in a past life, something you actually did, you probably wouldn't be hand pollinating from the same flower, right? You probably would maybe develop a cross.
Yeah,
right?
sometimes you would make a selfing. We call that a selfed cross, where I take one really spectacular plant, and I might like it so much. Typically with species, we might do that, where we take some type of orchid, and then we would actually then record that as, Brassivola digbyana times self. But what we could do is take another similar type orchid and then make something completely different. We can even do intergeneric things where you can take Odontoglossums and Oncidiums and things and breed them together and create new genuses.
So we have about 200 orchids in here, right?
Right.
Can I cross any with any?
Not always.
Not always?
Not
Yeah.
always. You'd be surprised though. Sometimes things will happen where it'll work, and you'll find some really quirky crosses. But frequently there'll be sort of aligned genera, we would say, where they'll be close, in other genus. So Lalias with maybe Brassivolas. Well, this is a Sophronitis.
Yeah.
Here. Well, actually,
Right
it's been
here.
changed.
Yeah.
Now it's Cattleya coccinea. It used to be Sophronitis. But you could breed that with other Lalias, Brassivolas, other Cattleyas.
I was going to say, like, when you look at this one, obviously has quite a different growth habit than this yellow one back here.
Right.
And I go, can I make that jump? Or
Right.
is that a little too far,
With this dendrobium, probably it is too far a jump. But I could, one of the ways you can get a clue is if the structures are similar. So anything that would be in that same, well, even this is a encyclia, that would possibly
Very
cross.
small one.
Very, very small flowers.
Very delicate one.
Well, that's what's so cool about orchids too. Some
Wow,
of the flowers
scent.
are huge.
Have you this
oh,
one?
Isn't
This
that
one's
great?
almost like laundry detergent.
Ooh,
Don't you
that one
think?
is interesting.
So
They're
talk
really
to
cool.
me about the wall here, because this is, obviously we have potted up versions, whether they're terrestrial or epiphytic.
Correct.
I would assume everything on this wall, being that it's literally mounted on wood, is an epiphytic variety. This just sort of looks like these are all just small varieties, yeah?
They are. So these would be really pretty miniature type of orchids, but this is really the way they grow in nature. So you can see where those roots.
Look at those roots,
They'll move, and when they first come out, they'll actually have this sticky substance. They'll basically glue themselves to the wood. If you go to try and pull that off now, you wouldn't be able to.
So the whiter one here is younger.
Correct,
This more green-brown is older and much more adhered.
Yeah, and then over time, some of the roots will dry up and die, but they're constantly sending out new roots. And then what's interesting too is that we'll have some flowers in this place that are huge, but then this is a really neat one. Look at the size of these flowers.
You
can't even see those.
I thought you were going here because these are small enough.
Those are tiny, but those are really literally a magnifying glass flower.
So if you were to look at this, you're telling me those are all little flowers.
That is one whole spike of tiny, tiny flowers.
And would I be seeing that petal sepal?
That same structure
setup
would apply.
Like if I looked, I guess you'd have to see a microscope.
Right,
at that point,
or a magnifying glass.
Does it have a scent? I bet not.
I don't think that one does, probably.
I think my nose is too big for it, honestly. I keep hitting this guy here.
Yeah.
What about care? When you see a plant, this is a very...
Isn't that a neat one? That's so pretty.
Wow, that one's Dendrobium linguiforme. Yeah. So when I see, this is just a bias maybe I have, is when I see a very beautiful plant and what looks to be a delicate plant, I think it's hard. Is that true with orchids or not really?
For instance, these that are on that wall, these would not do well, let's say, inside. You know, they really want to have greenhouse conditions because, again, they don't have any soil around their roots. They're depending on atmospheric humidity. A lot of times, if you're raising orchids like this on a slab or a piece of wood or a piece of cork oak, you're watering that maybe 2-3 times a week. So you're splashing this down, and that's not the kind of thing you can do terribly easily in the house. But there are some that are so easy to grow. Like in San Diego, you could grow them outdoors on your patio with just a little bit of cover. Some you could grow inside the house. Really, the Trader Joe orchids, mostly Phalaenopsis. Those are easy.
Yeah, that's what I'm used to seeing. I mean, I think everyone watching is probably used to seeing that long stem and then these big petal sepal flower combos. Wow, look at this one here.
Isn't that sweet?
That one's going down. Dendrobium pendulum.
Yeah, some of them do grow pendulously. In fact, look at that. Look at the species name. It's Dendrobium pendulum.
Pendulum, yeah. And look at the I don't know what to anatomically call that, but it sort of clusters at each node and kind of resets. Unique look on that one.
Yeah, and little flowers coming out of those nodes as it goes down.
Let's talk rare, because you know last time, I mean, we're actually, John, standing underneath it. The Espiritu Sancti, my namesake, the plant I've been hunting for, and you guys are sort of flaunting it.
We'll have to get a cutting for you.
Hey, look, if you're the one who suggested it,
listen now,
I was going to try to bribe you.
Up to that.
I was going to try to bribe you. But yeah, I mean, in the world of orchids, I can only imagine there's quite rare ones. Maybe even species that there's not that many of. I'm wondering, you got 200 here, what can we highlight?
Kind of intimidated to say so that somebody doesn't come in and hurt
let's keep
plant.
But let's keep the prices out of the conversation.
I would say that any of these larger orchids easily would sell for $500-600 a piece.
Wow.
You know, when it's a nice specimen like this, if you could get it, they're pretty valuable.
Yeah. From a size perspective, that impacts the value, right? But
sure,
from
the older it is.
From a beauty, or maybe even what about just pure rarity?
Sure. There aren't any here that I would describe as being really, terribly rare, but some pretty tough to find. I mean, like there's one called Paphiopedilum rothschildianum that used to be, gosh, if you could find one, it would be maybe $400 per fan. And it's a Paphiopedilum, which is like these over here. And that's an expensive orchid, and that's 40-50 years ago.
That's crazy.
So, that we would sell, there was one particular hybrid we had that we sold some of to Japan for $10,000.
Are you serious?
40 years ago.
Wow.
Because this was just on the cusp of everybody doing tissue culture. So they buy it for 10 grand, but then they own that plant, and they can make thousands.
They tissue culture at one time, and they can, the tissue from the tissue. Yeah, exactly.
Because it was just such a cool orchid.
Wow. Yeah, so variance-wise, we obviously saw the ones that the flowers are so small you can't even see them really.
Right.
And then I'm looking at this one,
That's a pretty
Hawaiian
big one.
Talent. I mean, this is huge.
Isn't that big?
Is this as big as they'll get, or is it even larger?
There are some that'll maybe get another inch or two even bigger than that, but that's about as big as those are going to get.
That's a nice
That's a big one, isn't it?
That's a really nice.
Imagine grandma with that as a corsage. That used to be the big corsage flower.
Honestly, my grandma is such a small Filipino grandma.
Oh, yeah.
It would be like the size, it's almost the size of her head.
And then, this is a very similar type. That's been changed. It used to be, I grew up, they keep changing the names of plants just to keep my brain active. And that's now Guarianthe skinneri, but it used to be a Cattleya skinneri. And so that's changed, but it's really this type of orchid, but look at the number of flowers.
Yeah, way more
per stem.
Per stem, yeah.
It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it's interesting how this would be, I guess, 3 or 4 per stem, and then that one has. And then I guess it's something to do with how many are planted in that cluster too, right? You can sort of manipulate the
And then as the plant gets older, more mature, and these pseudobulbs get really plump and thick, then the flowers will get better. The healthier the plant, the more different growth points you've got on it, the better it'll be.
If I'm caring for these at home, let's take maybe this one right here as an example, the Cornelia v.
Cerulean.
I got a tongue up. Tahoe rose. I mean, that's a very complex one. Is this structurally in the actual pot itself? How many orchids are in this pot?
That's one orchid.
So it's one.
And it may have more pseudobulbs, but and this would have been an epiphytic type orchid, but almost everybody will grow them in a mixed media, which usually contains either coconut coir, it could be bark. I've grown them in pure pumice. You can grow them in lots of different things, or combinations thereof, you know.
Yeah.
But you're really looking for something that drains well, that won't rot, and that kind of mimics what they would maybe have if they were growing epiphytically.
So it is an epiphytic plant, but it's planted in a media that might not at first blush, especially if you're a new gardener, look epiphytic. It might look more like a mix, but it's just not.
But it will tend to be very open, very airy, so it drains well.
So when you're talking this being one orchid, where I'm going with this is you've got these pseudobulbs. Are they clumping and sort of throwing out more from the base so that can you divide?
You can. You can divide orchids out. So they will try. It's hard to find a suitable one to explain that. Might be easier on one of these.
Let's hunt one down.
So here's a new growth point.
Okay.
And we call it popping an eye. It'll actually have a growth that pops out.
Yeah.
And they're latent. Here's one here that's a latent bud right there.
That little nub.
That
right
little
there,
nub there.
Okay.
And so this is one of those little growth points, and it's now throwing a new pseudobulb and then these leaves. And this is a bifoliate. It will open up and create leaves like this as it matures.
Okay, I see.
And so over time, the bigger plant you have, you could take that and divide it into 3 or 4
That's
plants.
what I was going to ask is, so let's say I do want to do that. Obviously, maybe it's not at the exact right size to do so now. Am I going to wait until this new offshoot has developed some of its own root system?
Correct.
Then cut it off and move it.
So typically what my rule of thumb is that I won't make a division less than about 4 bulbs.
Okay.
Because they don't have enough energy and life there to sustain that hard, it's a hard thing for them to be cut off. And so I want to have at least 4 bulbs that I can then really get that plant well established.
Okay. We've seen a few, but there's probably 100 we haven't looked at, right?
There are so many good ones.
We haven't gone over here. I'm curious what's over here.
Look at this dendrobium.
Oh, wow.
Look how many flower spikes.
And this and are you telling me again that this is one?
That's all one plant.
That's crazy to me. Where my head goes, maybe because I grew up playing Pokemon, is I want to catch them all. I want every single one. But I'm okay if it's smaller. I just want to have it, right?
Yeah.
That collector mentality. But who knows? I mean, maybe I'll want to grow some large ones.
And some of the orchids, orchids just, they're classy plants. They're classy flowers. And when I was much younger, I would take plants and rent them.
Really?
Yeah, I would rent them to Nordstrom's.
No way.
Yeah, and so they just have them like in the ladies department or something, and this is 40 years ago, and I'd rent them out, and because it looked really classy. Yeah. But this is really a spectacular thing.
That one's, I mean, the stems on those, or the pseudobulbs are really thick on that one.
And that's one of the easier orchids to grow. That'll grow outdoors here.
So, okay, I know we talked a little bit about care. I kind of want to go back to it.
Yeah.
Maybe with this beautiful backdrop here. I mean, look at this one. Yeah, the ones that have the final petal or that lip petal be completely different in the color compared to the rest, I think are really striking.
Yeah.
But if I want to get into orchids, right? That's part of why I'm here, is to try to figure out how to get into the game.
Sure.
Where should I begin?
I would start with something easy. So you can get, one of the things, I go to Trader Joe's at least once a week.
Okay.
And every time I'm there, I look to see what they have, because most of the time it's going to be Phalaenopsis like behind you there. And those are very, very common now. And those are easy, but very frequently there might be, in that big group of plants, there'll be one zygopetalum, which you like, and that's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
There'll be a Miltonia maybe in there. There'll be maybe an Oncidium that is unlike all the others. So one of the things I do when I look for plants, it's like after I've been around plants for 50 years, it's like there's a sea of things, but one thing catches my eye.
Yeah.
It's which of these is different.
Sure.
And so my eye will go to the one that is unlike the others, and I probably buy a plant every time I go.
Do you really?
I really,
so you're
I still do.
Well, how many orchids do you have in your own personal collection?
Oh, not that many anymore. Probably 30, 40, but
I mean, that's a lot.
I used to have
that's a lot.
I used to have acres of orchids, but no longer. But those are easy. So the zygopetalum is easy. The Phalaenopsis are easy. This is an easy orchid to grow.
This guy here?
For a beginner. Those are Cymbidiums, and those are true terrestrial orchids. They're from Asia. There is one species from Australia.
Wow. Sim, son of freak. That's
an interesting name,
quite the
isn't
name,
it?
Yeah.
Now, if you want to do your own hybrid, you can name it anything you want. So,
that's now I'm in. Now you got me in, because I need to name something
How
stupid.
about Cymbidium epic gardening?
There you go. Cymbidium epic. It's coming. 3-4 years
so
from
we'll
now,
be looking for it. We'll be looking for it.
Actually,
But this is an easy plant to grow
if you
outdoors.
are breeding it, John, like we talked about how to breed it, right, or how to cross it. Excuse me. From seed though, it's got to be years? I mean,
On Phalaenopsis, believe it or not, I've actually had some that would bloom in the flask. We actually grow them in flasks in a grow room. You know, they're in
a flask.
Yeah, they're in sterile media.
Really?
And we raise them on auger. And I have had a few little Cymbidiums, or Phalaenopsis rather, that would bloom maybe 2 years old in a flask. Most things are going to take 5 to 6 years to bloom. So this is a long-term
it's a long game.
process.
I mean, I've talked to a lot of folks in the plant where I met a guy who took 20 years to make a potato from seed.
Yeah.
You know, from true seed, not a seed potato.
And plumeria will take 7 to 10 years sometimes to
That's
bloom
wild.
from a seed. So you want to start when you're young. See, you've got so much life ahead of you.
I've got, let's see, 5 years. I'm 35. I might live till I'm 80. That's 45 years. I got 9 rounds.
You can do a lot of hybrids, Kevin.
I can do a lot of hybrids.
You can do a lot. Yeah.
Well, dude, thank you so much for showing this.
Oh, hey, it's always
been
a pleasure to
fun
have
come
you
up.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will see you soon.
Yes.
And if you're in the area, the World of Orchids exhibit is still going on. San Diego Botanic Garden. Check it out. Good luck in the garden. Keep on growing.